Welcome back to Red Life Podcast. Thank you for joining us today. If you haven't already done so, please remember to subscribe to our channel or like our Facebook page, depending on where you're watching this. Also, remember to share the video if you can. That would be great. Remember to like the video. Remember to like the post if you are watching this on Facebook or on YouTube. Thank you to our audience on YouTube and on Facebook for joining us. Today, we have a very interesting special discussion about women and especially women of color in the online media spaces. We have a very special guest with us to discuss this. So we're going to talk about all of these issues. So first, I'm going to ask you to say hello to my co-host, Moxie.
Hi, everybody, and I apologize for the lateness. That was all my fault because I've been having a bit of technical issues. So hopefully we're going to get through this live stream okay, because we've already been having some interesting discussions. So hi, everybody. Welcome back.
And thank you. And also, I want to welcome Wendy Muse. And Wendy is the host and co-host of Left POC. So say hello, Wendy, and please introduce yourself. Oh, you're muted.
My bad. I'm performing the traditional error with these sorts of things. Yeah. So hi, my name is Wendy Muse. As Kieran already said, I'm the host of the Left Pocket Project podcast, also known as Left POC, and I'm really excited to be here to talk to you all. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming and joining us today. So first, we wanted to introduce our audience to the Left POC or Left Pocket podcast. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that? I saw it personally. I saw it sort of the initial days of it. I remember how it started a little bit. But if you could, tell the audience how it started, what it's about and how it started, that would be great.
Sure. So in 2016, for those of you who may not know, this was the infamous year of the election between Hillary and Trump. And in the lead up to that, we saw like a ton of diminishing, dismissing, insulting leftists of color and leftists in general, right? Sort of with the Bernie Sanders campaign. But there was a lot of sort of negation of the contributions and ideology that comes out of people of color who are on the left. And when I say left, it's a very expansive thing for me. So I'm not just thinking about, just communists or just anarchists, but sort of the wide array of anything to the left of the Democratic Party, of which there are many factions, right? And I wanted to honor that. And so when I kept seeing these things about these weird takes, from centrists and liberals who were saying, oh, but Black people are centrist, or Black people are conservative, or Indigenous people or Hispanics are going to vote this way, and everyone loves Clinton. There was just like a complete whitewashing and negation of a very rich history of, leftist thought, ideology, and organizing on account of people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so I said, let me start tweeting about this. I'm working on a PhD regarding leftists of color in Brazil and Portuguese-speaking Africa. And so it was strange to me to see these sorts of people getting denied, like they don't exist, right? All these communists of color don't exist. And so I was tweeting under the hashtag LeftPOC these books, just like any books that I had read or that I found interesting that focused on or that were written by leftists of color, right? And spoke about the work that they did and the contributions that they made to left ideology. And then from there, I also noticed that there were, of course, problems on the left as well with regard to sort of underplaying or not knowing anything about leftists of color history. On top of that, the ones that they did know, it was always like the same 5 people that they highlighted over and over. And so I said, okay, I didn't want to do a podcast in the beginning because I was like, I don't have time for this, like whatever. But everyone was like, you should consider doing a podcast. And so I decided to try my hand at it. I already had some audio skills because I used to DJ and stuff like that. So I said, let me combine what access I have to the intellectual stuff and academia with things that I see happening online. And so I decided to start an entire project. So it's not just a podcast, as I always say. It's a project where I really highlight the work of movements that were led by and comprised of people of color, Black and Indigenous people as well, of course, and in the left sphere. And so that's how it started. And I wanted really to bridge academia, and the regular public, because that's another problem that I see a lot with academia. Like, people will write these articles that no one ever reads, right? Like, it's behind a paywall, it's in these journals that you have to have a subscription to, or you have to go to this school or that school to have access to this professor. And I was just like, that's insane to me. Like, for me, what changed me and what radicalized me was in part, these elections and things that I had seen, but also what I had been able to read and hear from academics who were studying these leftist histories. And I said, there needs to be a connection between these sort of sometimes disparate or separate realms. And so that's why I decided to bring the two together. And from there, like I said, it became a project. I try to highlight as much as I can, leftists of color on the Twitter page. So I'll have, for example, Left POC of the Week, where I talk about often ignored or unknown, little known leftists of color from around the world. And I also really commit myself in this project to having an anti-imperial stance, an anti-colonial stance. And I think it's important for us to understand that, like, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like, people have been working on this since time immemorial, right? And it's really important for us to understand the roots of this sort of left ideology and understand that we're not alone in thinking this way. We're not the exception. We're actually the majority. Most movements of on the left are led by and comprised of people of color around the world. Like, the white minority that we see so much influence from in the United States is, as I said, a minority, right, in left spheres. And so it's important for us to recognize that in the global space, leftism coming from people of color is not unusual. It's the norm, and it's something that we need to honor and appreciate and see ourselves in. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for that. That's, there's so many interesting things there. First of all, I like how you talked about academia being behind a paywall. I went back to university a few years ago, and that was one of the most frustrating things, especially because I was studying anthropology, and anthropology, sort of modern anthropology, has this sort of like, oh, we are so, we really care about the underdog, we are, the subaltern, and the, all of this stuff, but yet there's no the actual knowledge that's being generated is behind these paywalls, hundreds, thousands of dollars sometimes that you have to put out before you can read these papers. And that's besides considering the fact that the language itself, sometimes it's so obscure, and it's almost written in that way so that you have to be a high level, like you have to be nothing but an academic to even, I think, grasp what's being said. Like, it's deliberately overly obscure language that's used, right? And then it's behind all these paywalls. And that always frustrated me, because I was like, this stuff is really important and the world should know about it, Why is it being hidden by the very people that we're talking about and saying that we care about or we are concerned about? While our careers are being made on the backs of these people, whether it's indigenous people or various marginalized communities, especially in anthropology. So anyway, not to go on an anthropology rant, which I could do for a while, but I know what you mean about that frustration with academia. One of the things I really like about your project is that you highlight these people from all over the world. So yeah. So could you tell us a little bit about how you do the research on this, or how do you know where to go, where to look?
So in many cases, like a lot of academics, I have to read a ton, and not only for my own research, but like for exams, right? To prepare for board exams and things like that, boards we call them. You have to read so many books, and in the process of doing that, sometimes it's from areas of the world that don't have anything to do, or not directly, with the regions that I work on. So I'm reading about other parts of Latin America, I'm reading about Asia, I'm reading about other parts of Africa that I don't necessarily deal with. I'm reading about a lot of stuff that's related to the United States as well. And when I say the United States, I'm thinking again specifically of Black and Indigenous people here, and of immigrant groups that come here from the global South. And so from doing all that reading, that's part of it. The other part, I think, is just kind of literally like going out and looking for it, because as I said, sometimes some of this information is not easily accessible, or it's it's not necessarily hidden, but it's not something that you learn in school, right? Like most of the stuff that I've learned about leftists of color throughout, this project is stuff that I'm learning in real time. So it's not necessarily things that I already knew or necessarily had exposure to. So one of the ways that I've found some of these people is obviously just through books, through primary text as well. So when you look at sort of the revolutionary readings and writings and speeches and things like that, that the revolutionaries that I care about or that I already knew about, we're reading, right? So, you have people like Huey P. Newton or Angela Davis or others reading Mao Zedong, right? They're reading, Vietnamese communism writings and things like that. So you have these sort of networks of ideology that are occurring, and you can trace them and find out more information about other leftists of color, because as I said, many of them were in dialogue with one another, if not through actual writing, which I've also seen in my own research, but also through their writings, right? So it's really important to kind of trace those, as they say in academia, genealogies, right? Trace the genealogies, the ideological genealogies, or, kind of think of it like a family tree of sorts. And with every reference you see, there's another chunk of information waiting in the wings. I also really rely a lot on bibliographies, believe it or not, because as sometimes there are things in the footnotes or in the bibliographies that are like more interesting and telling than like what's in the book, depending on what you're interested in. And you can get a lot of leads that way too. So that's another way I find things. The last way, sadly, because I don't like Wikipedia, but it's through Wikipedia. So sometimes when you're doing research on one group of people or one person or one particular movement, sort of in passing, you may find at the bottom that they'll have things that say, like, for example, list of, Syrian communists or list of people who were involved in this movement from this date. And so if you click on it, you can then find additional people. And then I do my own separate research, obviously, because I recognize that Wikipedia, unfortunately, has some spotty affiliations of its own with the State Department and things like that. And so I have to combine, a multitude of sources to get the information. But that's how I usually find it.
Mm-hmm. Great. Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, Wikipedia is a good starting point, but that's exactly it. Like, it's not a bad place for a starting point, but you have to go out there and then look up your own stuff separately. Moxie, do you have any questions for Wendy?
Well, yeah, what was coming to my mind when you were speaking about sort of the same 5 Black leftists of color, especially if it's in an American context, right, or within our imperialist core. We always hear about the same people, but there's a wealth of leftists of color all across the world. And that is one of the things that I like about following you too, because one of the things that connected me with Kieran was that very thing, is all the resources that you share. So it's really great to get those resources. But then it's in school, in a very, in the primary education way, are we learning about these women of color from across the world, or are they always going to be the same people? And I still, even like 20 years ago was when I was last in that, in those schools, like 30 years ago, I never learned about half the people that I know of in the last 5 years of being a communist. I learned so much just by being a communist and talking to other people on the ground and getting access to really good free PDFs behind no paywall. They're just links getting thrown out there and clicking on the links and reading accessible stuff, to Kieran's point, and learning so much richness, like Kwame Ture, W.E. Du Bois, like all of these people that you don't hear too much about until you start getting into the real nitty gritty of socialism, Pan-Africanism, leftist circles, those kinds of things. And that's what's really rich. And I think that misses a lot, even in online spaces, where we can access a lot of stuff by following our little bubbles, right? You follow the people who you're going to get great resources from, but it's still there's still a lot of recycled stuff that happens within just America, right? Just like the imperialist core America, not South America, and the same kind of information. So yeah, it was just more of a comment than anything else. But I also wouldn't mind asking Wendy if she, what was your experience when you were younger and in school that made you interested in wanting to know more of that, more radical thought?
Yeah.
of
So I
Black
grew.
people of color?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I am originally from the South, so I'm from Memphis, Tennessee. And, that's where Martin Luther King was murdered. That's where we had a lot of strikes and things like that during the civil rights movement. There's a lot of radical history that happened in the South that gets also sort of whitewashed in our discussion of the civil rights period. There were communists involved. There were leftists involved. Many of the leaders were women of color, obviously. And so there were roots there, right? But one of the things that I found in growing up, I went to a predominantly white school. It was all girls. I was the only Black person in my grade. And when it came time to learn about anything related to Black people, for example, it was, a sentence or two about slavery. We had a little bit about colonialism in Africa. And that was pretty much it. There wasn't a big focus on that. We spent a ton of time on the Renaissance. We spent a ton of time on the Industrial Revolution. And there was, of course, a reinforcement of like white Eurocentric capitalists notions of history. And so even though at the time, I was in high school, I didn't necessarily have the same political ideologies that I have now. Those leanings came later. But at the time I was a Democrat, like whatever, liberal. And even then I noticed like there's something missing, right? Like there were people who were doing more radical things that we don't really talk about or learn about. And I knew because my family mentioned them or, I would hear about them through other means. And so that's where I knew that there was something already missing. And then I decided to actually go into history in general because it was just a topic that I felt like needed to be further enriched, right? And I ended up, my sort of venture into Brazilian history and things like that is a much longer story that I won't go into here. But I think I can definitely say that living there and doing that kind of research also further radicalized me, right? So I would have to take classes that talked about the histories of imperialism in South America and things like that. And when you see truly what the U.S. is doing elsewhere and has done and continues to do and will likely do into the future unless we interrupt it in some way very drastically, that radicalizes you because you say like, oh, I'm living among these people. These are my friends. These are people that I'm staying with, that I'm breaking bread with, that I'm going to class with and learning from and doing things with. And yet my country wants to kill them for no reason and take their resources and like harass and abuse them. And when you start putting those two things together, it changes you, and it makes you want to explore more and learn more. And so that's really, I would say, that for me was a pivotal moment in my ideological formation. And it made me look into how are people fighting back and how are these fights connected, right? Because I said, okay, the situation of Black people in the United States is very similar to the situation for Black people in Brazil and most of South America. There were connections, and those connections came because I recognized, okay, we obviously shared a sort of capitalist-driven history of slavery and enslavement and abuse, but then also imperialism and colonialism. And so once you make those connections, your whole world opens up, right? Because you can then begin to see that there is a resistance to these types of abuses from the top down and from the state and from society as well. And you kind of wonder, you start to put together like, okay, what are things that we can do here? What are things that people have already done here that I never learned about? And that's where I think a lot of the internationalist stuff came in for me too, just like living somewhere else for a period of time and starting to connect more dots that way and going from there.
I'm so glad you pointed that out. It's also like, a lot of the people throughout the world that have been making the changes and pointing out the abuses and the violence of imperialism and colonialism and the historic violence of it as well are people of color. There are a lot of women who, that's another aspect that gets kind of like, pushed behind the doors and closeted and quieted down a bit. And it's because of the deeper struggles and the historically connected struggles that I think women and people of color throughout the world are, always at the front lines, always have been at the front lines, right? And then the people who get broadcasted and platformed are the white savior complex type people, almost like how humanitarian organizations get like all of the voice, all of the platforms around what they're doing to help people in war-torn areas, but they're funded from the, by the CIA or one of their associates, So it's like, but they get the platform in the imperialist core, and it's always everything that comes out of the imperialist core while you're living in it. It really forces you into this bubble, and you have to push outside of that bubble. And I think too, it's traveling for me that really opened up my mind as well to other Indigenous struggles in South America and how related to Indigenous struggles here, and it was very eye-opening for me as well in that same way.
And on that note too, I just wanted to add quickly, this idea of the imperial core even dominating in left spaces elsewhere is super important, because you have the same 5 people that get recycled here getting recycled elsewhere that then unfortunately dominate the histories of those places. So like I always use Brazil as an example, just because that's closest to me in terms of my research and things that I see. And so, for example, Angela Davis, she is revered among Black women activists in Brazil and Black activists period in Brazil, women activists. And yet, there are so many women of color, Black women, Indigenous women who were freedom fighters in Brazil. And many people, but people in Brazil don't know them, right? They may not be able to name them. Like unfortunately, I can name more in some cases than some of my Brazilian peers. And there's a reason for that, right? Unfortunately, what ends up happening is that as liberatory and important as the people who are doing that kind of work here are, it ends up also dominating in left spaces elsewhere. And that's a problem for me, at least in my opinion, because while it should be inspiring and things like that, it shouldn't overshadow the work that's being done by the local population as well in these areas. And it's something that I'm really adamant about, and I'm involved in a project that's related to kind of highlighting a lot of the work of Black activists and Black feminist activists in Brazil. But it's something that's I certainly try to also encourage people to do, is like go beyond just the Americans that you know about and try to see what you can learn from other places, because they're learning from us, right? They're constantly in dialogue with and thinking about what are Americans doing, right? But it gets to the point where Americans even dominate left spaces, much like you were talking about how men or white men dominate left spaces here. And that's a problem. I mean, you can, as I said, you can learn from them, but it shouldn't overshadow the local work that's being done that's specific to those conditions that I think is actually more impactful and that should be highlighted and known about. And that's being, people are working on that, but it's certainly an issue in my opinion, that sometimes the work of people there locally gets overshadowed by American figures.
Absolutely. And I think, Kieran, what do you think? Like, I feel like this is touching on a lot of decolonial thought too, around knowledge and access to knowledge, and who are the knowledge keepers and whose knowledge gets out there and is accessible and all of these things, right? And but it's and local community stuff as well, like going back into those real freedom fighters, grassroots people on the ground, and really valuing their knowledge as being just as, if not sometimes greater than, I love Angela Davis, and I'm sure everybody here does. We've quoted her lots in the past. But yeah, to your point, Wendy, I think it's so important that we platform those people on the ground. We platform those people and hold them up for just being the fighters that they are, right? Yeah. Anyway, I can go on and on and on, but I start to babble, so I'm gonna pass it off.
That's okay, no problem. Well, one of the things I wanted to also talk about today, just to change gears a little bit, is the sort of related, especially with you as another left media creator, Wendy, was the way that being a woman, and especially a woman of color, in online media spaces, and what the experience is like. Because as anyone can see, anybody who's paying attention, the online media, whether it's podcasts or live streams or YouTube channels, the left spaces are dominated by men, especially white men. A lot of them are great people. I have nothing against them as a rule or anything. But what it does is that it makes this idea, speaking of who gets to have knowledge and who gets to be the bearer of knowledge, it becomes, I feel like there's a certain almost unspoken sense of authority that is conveyed by your gender and your race. And those of us who are not white men, we don't seem to be seen at, we don't seem to be taken as seriously by the same communities of watch listeners or audiences. So I mean, I don't want to paint too broad of a brush with that. I don't think it's true of everyone, but I think that if you look at I know this is kind of a touchy subject for a lot of people, but I feel like it's something that we need to talk about, and especially us as a podcast run by two women, and myself being a woman of color as well. I noticed that there are certain things that are just we're not taking as seriously, especially if we're just running it as with just women. If we don't have a male partner or co-host or something. So you being a Black woman in this space, you've been doing this for a few years. Would you say there's some truth to what I'm saying, or what is your experience when it comes to that?
I mean, it's absolutely true. I always say, that there's always this discussion about like, is online real life and blah, blah, blah. And the issue is not so much, is it real life or not, but how it reflects our life offline, right? So it's not for me a dichotomy of real life, not real life. It's a dichotomy of online versus offline, but these things overlap, right? And one of the areas where I see a lot of overlap is obviously sexism, racism, homophobia, et cetera. Online spaces are a microcosm of what we experience offline. And so one of the things that I remember very clearly is when I first started Left POC, I had several people actually, not just one person, but several people asked me like, oh, who does your audio? Who's your producer? And I was like, me, right? Like, you're talking to her. I'm the producer. Like, because most people, a lot of podcasters have producers, and usually they're guys. I mean, like 99% of the time, a lot of podcasters pay someone to do the editing and all of that for them. And like, I was doing all of the editing from the jump, just literally everything from A to B, from beginning to end. I was the one managing it and overseeing it and doing it in my own free time. And so sometimes then that would like transition to, oh, like your audio is kind of weird in this episode or whatever, like you should use this program or that program, or you should like talk to this person. And it became like a nitpick of sorts that I thought was funny, because here I am like doing this podcast all on my own, and it's a DIY thing. It's not supposed to be anything fancy. And then I would see these podcasters who were making like $1 bajillion a year get on air and fart and say like racist jokes, and then don't right, like they don't even have decent audio, and you hear all this noise in the background and shit, and then they're making $1 bajillion a year. No one's saying anything about their audio, right? No one's commenting and asking them who does their production. No one, you know what I'm saying? Like the criticism is not there. And the degree of perfection that is expected of them is not there either. So I think that's something that was sort of a hint right away of like, oh, we're going to play that game. Okay. Like I see where this is going. But beyond that, I think there's also a sort of, as you said, Kieran, like a reduction of authority in a lot of ways. I have to pull out I'm getting a PhD card a lot, which I hate, because I don't see having a PhD as some sort of, or getting a PhD as some sort of prize. You know what I'm saying? Like there are people outside of academia who are incredibly intelligent and who can run rings around anything anyone in academia knows. But because I'm a woman and a Black woman, it's often like assumed that I don't know what I'm talking about, right? Or that like there's no way that I could have read this, or that I could have had access to this or whatever. And I have to be like, look, I've read this like 40 times and I'm writing a dissertation on it. Like, just leave me alone, So that comes up a lot. And funny enough, I get it from like multiple sides, because I'll get it from like right wingers in Brazil who assume that I'm like this dumb American who doesn't know anything about Brazil. If I'm like saying something left leaning, like if I'm supporting Lula or whatever. And then I'll get it from Americans, and often like, white men, including those on the left, who are making all sorts of assumptions about what I know and don't know, and also, I should say, another thing that happened a lot is like whenever I was critical of Bernie Sanders, for example, which there's a lot of criticism to be had of Bernie Sanders from the left, I would get these comments like people assuming that I was a Clinton supporter without even knowing my ideology, and because they would see a Black woman and assume like, okay, well, Black women support Hillary Clinton, so she must be a Clinton supporter. And I'm like, no, I'm a communist. Like I don't support Hillary Clinton. But there's a degree to which, these kinds of dialogues get distorted in a lot of ways by liberal co-opting of identity politics, right? And I've been very careful about noting that it's the liberal co-optation thereof. It's not, to me, that identity politics themselves are liberal. They were started by, women in the Combahee River Collective who were queer, women of color, socialists. They're not interested in the liberal version of that. But liberals took that and ran with it. And I think the danger in a lot of like lefties who talk about identity politics in a derogatory way without separating and qualifying that they mean the co-optation of identity politics is that they're basically like throwing all Black people and especially women of color in the same bucket. Like we must all be liberals if we like care about racism or sexism that we're experiencing, and that, as I always have to emphasize, limit our access to the same resources as everyone else, right? And that limit our life, to be honest. Like if you have trouble getting a job because you're queer, or if your resume is thrown in the trash because you have a name that's seen as ethnic, right? That affects your material reality. That affects your material needs. That it affects your money. You know what I'm saying? So it is. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, you're bringing in the class analysis with that.
Exactly.
And I think that, and I love that you said the liberal co-optation of identity politics, because identity does matter in the day-to-day life, period. We're living in the imperialist core. There's racism, sexism, homophobia, everywhere you go. So It does impact your access to economic security, right? It just does.
Right.
And when we reduce it to, as communists, if we reduce things to only a class analysis, we are really, we're just eliminating massive solidarity aspects of what it is to be a communist, period, right? Like whether you're a woman, a man, or whoever, right? And wherever. But I'm so glad you brought that up, Wendy. I just had to jump in. Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, I mean, it's inevitable that you have, those things are connected, right? Like I'm not walking around with my like income written on my forehead, right? But when you do see me, you do see a Black woman when you see me, right? And you judge me on that basis. You may be able to read my class based on how I dress, or assume my class based on how I dress or how I speak or whatever. But those things are always moving up and down, right? Like if I say, for example, I'm getting a PhD, people assume one thing about my class status without knowing what's in my bank account, without knowing that like actually students don't make very much money at all. And, we're like struggling and begging for money all the time. So there are things that about the class level that are in constant motion, but the Blackness and the womanness for me is constant. It's a constant in terms of how I'm read, right? And so that influences my experiences all the time. And online, as I said, it's definitely one. And I think, like, God bless all the leftist guys who do podcasts and things like that. But I think that the bar for them is much lower. They're allowed to be mediocre. They're allowed to make mistakes. They're allowed to get things radically wrong. And they often make, I see a lot of takes that are not based in fact, or not based in like years of research, or, like I see all sorts of wild things being said. And then, if I say something, or if a person like me says something, it's not taken as seriously as something. And this is not just online, right? Like this is also in academic spaces, in the workplace, everywhere. Like I swear to God, I can count on 30 hands, like how many times in a class I said something and people are like, yeah, whatever. And then a guy would say the exact same thing and be like, oh my God, that's so deep. Wow. So this also happens online. And it's almost as if I think there's like, some people who studied language have talked about how women's range octave-wise or whatever influences how much we're listened to. And I don't know if there's any truth to that, but online, you don't hear me, right? You just see my words, but you do see my icon, or you do see my face in my avatar or whatever. And so that's when you get to say, I'm going to dismiss what she says or not listen to her fully. And I just want to mention before we, move on to another topic, like that's why sometimes I'm not inclined to post a picture of myself. Right now I have a painting that a piece of street art. But, I've dealt with harassment about my size, about my race, about so many things. And sometimes you're just like, you know what, this will, prevent some levels of that, and make my online experience potentially slightly, like maybe people can focus on what I'm saying more than what I look like. And, I'm sometimes tempted to just like post a picture of a man and change my handle and see how much I'm taken seriously versus without it,
Your follower and listenership or viewership or whatever we want to call it, it's probably it'll triple in like a week.
Yeah.
Guaranteed. No question. Who is this amazing voice of authority? Who is this?
Right.
Right.
Yeah. There's a saying that God grant me the confidence of a mediocre white man.
Right. Yeah.
It's true. I mean, and like I said, there are some good people among them. I don't want to have to keep prefacing it, but it's true, because I don't want it to be like, oh, you just hate men, you just hate white men. No, that's not what I'm saying. It's inevitable that among the many white men that are in online media spaces, there's going to be good ones and bad ones and mediocre ones and whatever. So I'm not saying that it's I'm just saying, why don't women of color get the same kind of platforms? Why don't women of color get taken as seriously? Why don't women of color get the same Patreon supporters? There are some podcasts making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year that are not producing content that is really miles and miles and miles above, what Wendy you're producing, for example. Like what are they doing that they deserve that much? I mean, it's great. I'm not saying that nobody should get it, but I'm just saying, like, why is it that it's usually only podcasts that are run by white men that are getting that kind of support, or podcasts maybe with like white women, but it's not I mean, I can think of maybe like one or two like non-white women who are getting any kind of platform. And we can, I don't want to get into why, but the number is very small. The number is very, very small. Meanwhile, you see, in our case, for example, with Moxie and me, we have had experiences where, similar to you, we've had people try to tell us how to run our own show, which I find so frustrating. Especially when you're not, if you were a seasoned podcaster and I come to you for advice, or I'm taking a class with you, I've asked for your mentorship, that's different. But if you're just like a random person who just and just decides that how to run, you've never run a podcast before, you've never run live streams before, but how to like run the show better than we do, and you're a man, that tells me that you're kind of thinking that what are these girls doing? They don't know what they're doing. Right. So on some level, like, what do you think, Moxie? Like, you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. So it is a little bit more than that, but we'll I guess probably leave out some of the details for that. But I think that the gist of what Kieran is saying, I mean, Kieran, just to point out too, I think if anybody listening to this has any sort of analysis on, gender and class and race and the intersections and what that means from our work, because this is work, right? Even though it's passionate and it's certainly, there's a huge amount of interest, that, like, Wendy, listening to you talk about how passionate you are about learning about left people of color and anti-imperialists and all those things. But just because it's our passion doesn't mean that there isn't quite a bit of work that goes into it, right? Because, I think anybody who's listening to this show right now, I would like to think, that they understand that this is the sentiment we're talking about. We're not talking about like, oh, we're going to bash this, white guy who's doing a podcast. That's not what we're doing. We're not doing that. We're just pointing out these sort of the double standards that are happening. And if people can't realize that, then sorry guys, and you probably don't want to watch the show. But going to what Kieran was saying, yeah, I think what happens is, like, we do have a platform. It's a small platform, and we enjoy doing it, and we enjoy meeting people like you, Wendy, and bringing people and kind of connecting other people to really good content that's online. So when we have somebody who is like sort of, telling us how to do a certain thing, we know for sure that if we were two men, there is absolutely no way that would happen. There just isn't. And in fact, we saw it happen a little while after that, where a similar thing was happening with two men, and this, the same person didn't say a word about their content. It was fine, right? So it's just, it's frustrating as fuck. It's really frustrating. Yeah, because it's
Yeah. No, I mean, that's what I'm talking about. That there was one of the reasons that we wanted to do this episode was in order to see if other women of color, especially women of color like yourself, Wendy, face the kind of thing. And you brought that story up about, about somebody asking you about the producer or the quality of your audio, like on your own. I didn't even ask for that. So that's obviously it's something that we experience where just random people will come up and try to like tell us how to do our job or tell us how to, and like you said, it's not just in online spaces. It's a reflection of everything that we see. I work in a very male dominated industry, and like it's mostly men. Almost every job that I've had in this industry, I'm almost always the only woman in that level. So there might be women above me, but I do like IT support, right? So I'm basically a technician, and at technician levels, it's mostly men doing that work. So you have women doing like HR and things like that, but very few women are going to go fix people's computers and stuff like that, right? It's like considered a mechanical job, right? So I get this a lot, where a lot of people, question if I know what I'm doing and things like that. I've seen it forever. So for me, it's very easy to recognize. It's not always easy to talk back to it because I still have like, I have self-doubt. And when it's happening, sometimes I can't even believe that it's happening. And I'm like, I'm taken aback because I don't expect it to happen, where somebody's just like randomly questioning what I'm doing because of my gender. But it does happen. It absolutely does happen. What about things like tokenism? Do you think that that's another thing that you deal with in your work, in your workplace, and in your online media space?
Yes. This is also very frustrating and something that, like, personally, I'm not interested in playing, right? I've definitely had, like invites to come on to shows and talk about things, but I've always said, like, don't just have me on to talk about Black issues, or don't just have me on to talk about women's issues. I'm not saying that about you all. Like, I love having this discussion. It's sort of it's a different thing, but like, I appreciate where you're coming from. You know what I mean? And like I have a friendship with Kieran, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's not like it's this random person out of the blue asking me to talk about these issues, because I also recognize that like Kieran goes through similar stuff that I'm talking about, right? But sometimes in general, in media spaces, Black people and people of color and women are asked to come on, and particularly women of color, right? White women are sort of used in a more generic way. But people of color are often asked to come on just to talk about like the people of color issues. So you'll see Latinos come on to talk about immigration and like the border crisis and whatever. But you won't necessarily have a Latino to come on and talk about the economy or healthcare or something like that, right? Because white people, and particularly white men, are seen as automatic authority figures, and so they're the ones who are the face of all these other issues, and oftentimes are also the authority figures on people of color and women. So they'll even be on in place of us to talk about our experiences. So it's like it's just this clusterfuck of who gets to speak and who doesn't and why. And like what's so frustrating as well is again, I see this all the time in academia. You will have someone, usually a white guy, who hardly speaks the language. And I know you see this a lot in coverage of the Middle East, right? Someone who hardly speaks the language, who's never lived there, who doesn't know anything about the history of a place, who will then come on and be the like correspondent from this particular country or this particular region, and he knows jack shit about the place, right? And they never interview local people. They never have any sort of liaising or discussions with local people, local press, nothing. It's always just this one person who's asked to stand in for the entire population, right, and speak for them, even though he personally can't communicate with them. So it's just this wild situation, like going back to this authority thing. But something that you mentioned, I want to just step back for a second. When you were talking about podcasts and like which podcasts get the most money and why, and like trying to figure out, why there's this disparity between, or this gap between like often people of color podcasters and white podcasters, white male podcasters to be more specific. I think the first difference is that oftentimes podcasters of color and left media people of color in general are talking about real issues. In a real, more, I would say often more sincere way. Obviously, there are funny podcasts by people of color, but on the left, I have noticed that there's a tendency of Black and other people of color podcasters who are a little bit more serious, right? Because this stuff directly affects us in like a really scary way. As you said before, Roxy, we're on the front lines of this stuff. So it's I think even more personal for us. We're not necessarily in this protected space looking and saying, oh, look at these workers, like we support them. It's like, no, we are those workers, right? We are those people who are in a precarious economic state and dealing with racism and other forms of discrimination on top of that. But I think also just the fact that like we tend to be less reactionary. And much like sex, being offensive and reactionary sells if you're trying to, and especially if you're promoting yourself among an audience that is also reactionary, right? They use it as a form of reinforcement. And so, they don't want to hear someone who's chastising them and saying like, maybe you would be, like being a better comrade means also listening to and understanding and supporting people of color among your ranks and like recognizing their struggles and not alienating them through racism and sexism and the like. And so I think that's another like difference that I've noticed between the two different types of podcasts. And then also just like who has buying power, right? Like people of color in this country, at least are in most countries, are on the lower rungs economically, and they don't have the disposable income to donate money to a Patreon necessarily. And often women don't either. And so you're looking at a group of people that can support you by retweeting or whatever, but they may not have the money to donate. And that's also why like I don't put anything behind a paywall. I don't believe in that. Like my Patreon is completely open. So any money that we make is purely donations. Like I don't have any content that's paywalled. And particularly because it's an educational podcast, right? So I want people to have access to all the stuff we're reading and talking about at all times. And then the last thing I just want to say is, I think also, and I'm speaking personally, but as I've heard from many other women of color podcasters and women podcasters, period, we're often dealing with multiple shifts of labor, right? So we're mothers, we're partners, we're, even if we're roommates, we're often doing more housework and things like that. We're engaging in care in the workplace that's sometimes uncustomary for men to do. So I was commenting, a little bit before, like you'll see in a workplace that's made up of multiple genders, that usually the people who are women and femmes are the ones getting the coffee, getting the tea, cleaning the workspace and the conference room at the end and whatnot, making sure people have a Valentine's Day gift, remembering people's birthdays, so there's this like, right, there's an additional layer of labor to what's already customary labor that people are performing. And so I think for women and people of color in general, because people of color also perform these tasks, even if they're male or not female, there is a degree to which we have several layers of work on top of the regular paid work that we do. And so that invisible layer of work also means that we don't have a lot of free time. And we don't have the time necessarily to create as much content as someone who technically is being taken care of by his partner or his coworkers or his mom or like somebody else that's doing that kind of invisible labor for him. And even as I said, you see that like there's so many parallels in academia, because like there've been reports coming out that during the pandemic, men in academia have been far more productive than women. Women are actually receding in productivity, and men are increasing in productivity and more likely to be up for like tenure and things like that, because they're able to produce more. Because women, especially if they have children, are now being saddled with the majority of the childcare, because you can't necessarily take your child to daycare or to do so safely, or to go to school safely. And so we are saddled now with childcare in a way that we weren't necessarily before. So and I'll stop in a moment. I promise I'll stop talking.
No, don't stop.
It's so important what you're saying. I think it's so relevant, so especially relevant for the COVID times too. It's very, very important.
It's like, it's something I was not expecting, right? So I was already saddled with a lot of work before I had a child. And then, as I said, I had a child, I gave birth right before our state went on lockdown. And like, my child was born at the end of February, and that's when COVID started ramping up here in the United States. And we haven't looked back since in terms of our numbers. So it's never been safe for me to have any sort of childcare. People do it. People will get maids and nannies and send their kid to daycare and all this stuff, but it's not safe. And, just thinking of my safety, my child's safety, my husband's safety, I decided let's just keep the baby at home full time. And so my husband works from home from like 9 to 5, 9 to 6. And then I take care of the baby. I'm a childcare worker right now. And then after work, after my childcare work, once 6 o'clock rolls around, then I'm like, oh, let me apply for jobs. Let me kind of look at my dissertation. Let me do my translation work. Let me engage in my other work. And then, so doing a podcast is like another task that I don't have time necessarily to do. I make time for it because I enjoy it. But it's something that, do writing and recording and editing and interviewing and all of that stuff that goes into producing a podcast is it's a time suck. And so, those things make me different from the average white male leftist podcaster who may have a kid, but like his wife is the one taking care of the kid, you know what I'm saying, or his partner. And it's a totally different setup. And so I think that I'm in many ways representative of people with or without kids who are often working multiple jobs, who are engaging in precarious or informal labor, who are doing things that aren't recognized economically. And there's not a lot of time to do this sort of thing. So we're dealing with a completely different dynamic. But that's where I think these things diverge quite dramatically sometimes.
Yeah, and another thing we've talked about this before while we were preparing for this podcast. But one of the other things is that not only do you have to put in all that extra work, if you're a mom or you're working and however you're, whatever time you have, you're putting it into creating the podcast and all of that. But then if you're doing anything on camera, you have to present. You have to present a certain way. If you're a woman, you cannot show up on camera looking the way that a man can come on camera. Okay, a man can get out of bed, maybe brush his hair, and get on camera. Women, if they want to have any kind of presence online and not be constantly harassed, have to spend possibly like an hour or 2 hours getting ready, washing their hair, fixing their hair, blow drying it, fixing it, whatever you do to it, putting on makeup, right? The right makeup in the right amount, contouring and blush and eyeliner. Eyeliner is my thing, so I always have eyeliner on, even if I don't have anything else on. But no, I'm just saying that there's a whole set of rituals that women have to follow before you're allowed to come on camera, if you don't want to be harassed or just like completely ignored. And even then, you have to be skinny. It helps if you're skinny and white. If you're not, I want our audience to go out there when you watch YouTube, when you watch a live stream, just notice what the men look like and what the women look like. Just notice if men look like your average man that you might see, that you might know in person, that you might look like. And if women look like your average woman, or if women all have to be extra pretty to be online, to be hosts, to have shows, and preferably white. But white or not, they have to be skinny, young, a certain kind of look, conventionally pretty. And to me, that there's a huge disparity there. Men don't have to look that way. Men don't have to be extremely sexually attractive in order to have their own show. You know what I mean? Women, and then we're talking in 2021, in the internet, in the big fucking, futuristic world of technology, it's the same old shit that women have been dealing with for hundreds, thousands of years. Right? I mean, do you see that? Because I feel annoyed at that. I'm like putting on my makeup and I'm like, shit, I have like 10 minutes left and I have to like hurry up. And I'm like, why do I have to do this? I wouldn't have to do this if I had a penis. That's all it is.
And you know what, Kieran, I know that there's probably going to be some people watching this that are going to be like, well, then don't do it. But I think you made a key point there, right? Yeah. Okay. So we don't have to do it. But if we are going to be on here and because we always, as women, we worry about safety. And I think women of colors in particular will worry about safety and harassment in online spaces. There's all of these other things that are going to come at us where men won't get. They just won't. They won't get that stuff. So we have to worry about, like, if we're not presenting in a certain way, we are going to potentially be setting ourselves up for really unsafe, harassing type things, right? within this online bullying type of thing. But that really resonated for me when you said that, Kieran.
I just tell people to notice what kind of person, what somebody looks like when you're watching them and what their gender is, and just notice the disparities between what is expected of women and what is expected of men. And there you will notice it.
Right.
It's not just something we're making up, right?
Yeah, and not just the appearance, but even the voice, right? So I luckily, like, I haven't had anyone say anything negative about my voice, but I've definitely heard of women podcasters on the left even like getting shit for not having the nicest voice or whatever. And I'm like, okay, so you don't even see me and you have something negative to say, like, get a grip, you know? But yeah, definitely there's a lot of time wasted in being pretty or trying to be pretty, because it's like, I don't know how well I succeed. But there's definitely a lot of work. No, but like, and not just, I'm not saying me, but like in general, right? Like we put so much time into being pretty and whatever that standard is. And it's wasted time because, as you said, we still get harassed. It doesn't matter. Like, so yesterday I was talking to Kieran, like when we were prepping for the show today, you know, just like checking levels and the video and stuff because my internet is shitty. And I showed up as me, as the mom who had not slept. I had on a beanie hat, hadn't done anything to my face, didn't draw on my eyebrows because I don't have eyebrows, for those who are unaware. And, you know, didn't have on a lick of makeup. I looked like death. I looked like the reality, which is that I hadn't slept at all the night before because I'm working on our translation project. And so this was the reality that I presented myself with yesterday. And then today, because I knew I was going to be on camera, I knew I would be on YouTube. Okay, let me put on my makeup. Let me do my hair, which, by the way, is a process that started last night because I had to like roll it up and paint it and all these things, right? Deep condition and whatever. And then today I had to break out the makeup that I haven't worn in months. You know, like find an outfit, you know what I mean? To like moisturize my elbows. There's so many things that have to be done that, like, under normal circumstances, especially in the pandemic, because it's just been like I'm in full pajama mode. And of course, like, you know, my kid might like spit up on me or something or throw food at me. So it's literally like, I'm not trying to be pretty, right? Like my child knows what I look like. My husband knows what I look like. They can deal with me as I am. But if I have to go, like, even to take her to the doctor's office, you know, I put on my nice clothes. Even though I'm wearing a mask, you know, I put my eyebrows on. Like, there are certain rituals that come with presenting to the public. And then add to that the fact that I'm Southern, which like is a whole other like separate layer of work. There's a lot of purchase and like femininity as a Southerner, and it's very intense. And like you're expected to have your hair right, your nails right. You know, like I am on the low level of things compared to like my family members and some other women from the South who definitely feel that kind of pressure. But then on top of that, you know, there's the racial element, which, and I really applaud women like Tressie McMillan Cottom, who's written about this rather extensively. But in her book, Thick, she talks about how like beauty as constructed in the United States and in Europe is based on the negation of Blackness. It's like the other side of what Blackness is not. So it's not so much a matter of you need to be skinny and wear makeup and whatever if you're Black to be pretty. She basically argues that like you're never going to be considered beautiful. You're never going to be truly what's beautiful in this society, because beauty is based on the opposite of what you inherently are, right? And so no matter how hard you try, the construction of beauty is based on whiteness itself, on European whiteness in particular, and it's something that automatically excludes, and intentionally so, women like us. And I think that there's a degree to which, I mean, there's a lot of truth in that, because as you said, even in left spaces, you do see that there are hardly any women of color. And this is including like Asian American women, Hispanic women, Middle Eastern women, et cetera. You don't see a lot of women of color. When you do see them, though, you'll notice that they are thin, they are young, they have, you know, straightened hair, or like they have their hair done in a certain way that's considered socially acceptable. You know, there are all sorts, they're usually lighter skin. And if it's sort of like these little moving parts, right? So if you're fat, you better have light skin or a certain type of hair. Or if you have dark skin, you have to be skinny or whatever. There's never like, you can't be all those things that are considered quote unquote ugly in our society all at once, because God forbid, right? God forbid you be like a human being who has traits that are naturally yours. So there's a degree of that as well in left media. And there's certain, I mean, it's very apparent, especially on the more popular, you know, especially visual, like YouTube shows on the left. You'll notice that the women hosts are often like the foil to the male host. So the male host might be fat, he might be bigger, he might be darker, whatever, but the woman is always his like polar opposite. She's thin, she's young, she has straightened hair, she always dresses a certain way, she wears makeup. She's the sort of socially acceptable side that the man maybe is not willing to present or doesn't feel like he needs to present as. Right. And I would also just add to this, it's not just about like cisgender women. It's also, I mean, I hardly know of any trans people in media, in left media, period. Trans women, the few that there are out there, are also, they tend to have lighter skin. They read very feminine. You know, they tend to wear a lot of makeup. So there's also that expectation on like, regardless of your gender in terms of like the femme spectrum, you're expected to be a certain way that people who are read as men or who identify as men just are not, regardless of their race.
Right.
Yeah. A certain leftist, big time leftist TV show that I didn't want to name, but you know, I can think of a certain male host who looks like a bag of potatoes, and the female host who has obviously had a lot of work done recently. And she is, you know, she looks like she got that work done. She looks like she got that $1 million paycheck and she got work done. And, you know, I won't name somebody, but, you know, if you know me, then you can write to me and ask me who I mean, if you don't already know who I mean. But you know, yeah, like, I think you're totally right. Like, there's these check boxes. So if you're like light skinned, like I'm pretty light skinned for Pakistanis. So I know I've always had that privilege. To a certain extent, even in the real world, like when I was young, I was told, oh, I'm going to get so many marriage proposals because I'm light skinned. And I was like, okay, you guys don't know anything about me. Anyway, but that was different.
I don't want the marriage proposal.
Thanks, you can keep it. But I always hated that. I always hated how I was like, people would look at my skin like it was some kind of like commodity on me, you know, that it's like a piece of clothing that I chose to wear, and somehow it was some like I was better than the darker skinned girls who are around or something. But you know, like yeah, there's definitely like, you have to be skinny, you have to be this, you have to be that. And again, not to say that the women of color or women or just everybody who's working in the field is not a good person to follow or listen to. I'm not saying that at all. I have a lot of appreciation for a lot of those people, and I know it's hard work no matter what you look like or what you are. But I'm just saying that it should be a more inclusive space. There should be broader you know, availability of resources and availability of platforms, so that people who don't fit those narrow confines of identity and looks get to have their say too, you know. Some of us are not skinny, young, whatever, straight haired, you know, whatever, people who will spend 5 hours, who have the money to get our teeth fixed and get our, you know, get the liposuction and get this and that. I mean, there's just so much. And it's just like, why do women have to confine ourselves? Why do women have to comply so much all the time? And especially, like you said, in visual formats. But also in audio formats, you're totally right. Like, you know, your voice is too nasal, it's too low, it's not feminine enough. You know, you say this too much, you say that too much. There's all kinds of criticisms that can be made. So anyway, Moxie, do you have anything to add to this?
Well, I think so, but I'm just, I'd rather the two of you sort of like add some of the stuff. I think, you know, what I'm thinking about a lot is, decolonizing aspects of beauty, just given what Wendy had mentioned. If you can also link that book that you mentioned as well, so we can put that in our links. So and to your point, Kieran, I think the one thing I would add is that if we're doing all this work as comrades and as activists and social justice people, out in our communities, you know, the online spaces are also communities, right? So to Wendy's earlier point, and Kieran, as you as well, like digging around and finding those resources and finding those voices that really need to be platformed more. So do that work on the online spaces too, and make sure that you are promoting those people and promoting like your podcast, Wendy. Go and check Wendy's podcast out. Support Wendy and support other people that are really just trying to get more resources out there to decolonize the internet. in that's the way I'm thinking of it anyways. But yeah, that's one thing I'd add. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. If you are out there, I mean, thank you for watching our show and listening to this. But do support Wendy's show. We've put links to it in the comments. It's Left POC, LEFT-POC, and follow her, Wendy Muse. That's also in the description for this video. You can follow her profile. And do you have anything else to add, Wendy, before we wrap up today?
Yeah, I always just have to say that my Twitter handle is actually @MuseWendy. So Wendy Muse is like some bot in Malaysia or something right now. Because literally, because I had the profile initially and then I forgot my password after like years and never used it.
Oh.
And then it got like hacked and stolen by someone. So it has like two tweets now or something. I don't know. But anyway. Mine is @MuseWendy. And obviously you can also find all the stuff about Left POC @Left POC. We're also on Patreon. As I mentioned, the Patreon is completely open to the public, so you don't need to donate or do anything like that to see the content. And I should just add that one of my favorite aspects of the podcast is actually the Reading Revolution series that we do. And I think it's one of the most important contributions that Richard and I make to the discourse, as you will, on the left, because what we do is we choose usually a short text to read that has to do with left ideology. It's either something that leftists of color were inspired by or wrote themselves. And so we've read a lot of really interesting decolonial stuff and anti-imperial stuff, anti-capitalist stuff that's written by people of color. And what we do is we post a free copy of it on the Patreon. And then that way you can read it along with us, more or less. And then we have the discussion. And you can always send us comments and things like that, and we engage them either during the podcast or afterward through a variety of means. But we use our Patreon to promote those things. The other thing I just want to add too that's innovative about Left POC that you don't see other podcasts doing is that we put all of our funds, any funds that we raise, back into the podcast and also into supporting other podcasts. So we donate on Patreon to other podcasts, particularly of podcasters of color who do leftist content. We support them on Patreon. And then we also, what we'll do is when we have a guest, we donate, we give them like a small remuneration as a thank you for their time, because we recognize that, time is money and they deserve some sort of payment for their time. But we also donate that fund to a matching fund to an organization of their choice. So that's how we kind of give back to the community, and we're not just making money and pocketing it. We're not really making any money, right? And I also I pay Richard, I pay anyone who does any assistant work for us. I pay people who do transcription work. I give people $25 an hour, which is absurd for podcasters, at least in the United States, and certainly it's above the minimum wage. So I'm always making sure that what I'm putting out there and what my personal ideology is reflected in the way that I run the podcast. And I think that's really important, because people need to sort of, I think they need to walk the walk as well, not just to say a bunch of stuff on Twitter or their podcast or YouTube to make money, because it's hip right now to be on the left, but they need to actually run their podcasts or their YouTube channels in a similar way. And many, many, many of them don't.
That is so great. And that's our goal too. We are very low, on the very low end. We can barely make our payments for StreamYard and Zoom and the hosting for the audio with the podcast, with the Patreon that we have. So if you are watching this, please support us on Patreon. We really need that help, because we would like to get to that point where we can compensate our guests, as well as donate towards community support and things like that. So one of the things I really love about you, Wendy, is how much integrity you have and how you do live those things. You know, you don't just talk about it. And I've known you for many years online, and we've talked offline. And you were one of the first guests on my old podcast that I used to run. We had a lot of fun with that. That was in 2017, simpler times. I had a podcast called Not Your Cup of Chai, so some of you might know about it, but it was a bit lighter, maybe, but it was I don't know, it didn't last very long because I was just doing it by myself, and it's a lot of work. But Wendy, you were on, and there was a couple episodes that we had. We talked for like 3 hours, and we didn't stop talking. But thank you so much for coming on today. Any parting thoughts, Moxie, or are we good to wrap up?
Thank you so much. I think this was really a wonderful discussion, and it was really great to meet you, Wendy. Thank you.
Thank you all as well.
Thank you so much, and good luck with being a mom and being comrade mommy.
Stay safe.
Yeah.
Thanks, y'all.
Give our love to the family, and we'll hopefully have you on again, and we'll talk about something else. And everybody check out Wendy at Muse Wendy on Twitter and Left POC at LEFTPOC. Please do check it out. Really worth it. Really great show. Take care. All right. Have a good one.
Thanks
Bye, everyone.
Take care. Bye, everyone.